Our next talk is Prabal Saxena, and we'll be talking about in-situ artificial substrate witness plates, ground truths for key processes on the moon and other planets. Thanks, Prabal.
And Seiji, I will have a question for you later, so I will keep that for the end. But I'm going to talk to you about in-situ artificial substrate witness plates, ground truth for key processes in the moon and other planets. We've been calling our version of these in-situ, these witness plates, biscuits. I can tell you that story some other time, but I'll use it for shorthand. Basically, just to start with what witness plates are, before we get to kind of the motivation, these are basically passive recording plates that can record processes that really are pretty diverse. So they've been used in the past in a whole number of different areas. Really, the heritage begins in some ways from impact ejecta experiments, where you'd have these plates that would record this fall from a particular impact ejecta, but they've also been used for contamination studies. They actually have a really great heritage on the moon, particularly during the Apollo years. There are a number of notable examples, but the solar wind composition experiment, there's a really nice review by Geis et al. In 2004 that actually used these these foils that were placed on the lunar surface in order to kind of capture variations in abundances in the solar wind. So this isn't necessarily a new idea, but I think what this team was really aiming to look at, and why we kind of thought about this, is in the context of this idea of sustainable lunar exploration. So when you hear the word sustainable for lunar exploration, it often refers to the idea that it will be longer term, more persistent, will enable human exploration. And in another sense, though, it also ensures that because you will be there for a more persistent period, for longer periods, there are other considerations that you need to start to incorporate. So things like ISRU, availability, protection of astronauts, things that have been discussed at this conference pretty significantly and that are really on the minds of a lot of people. And there's an additional context too, which is kind of stewardship of these places that will be visited. And this is something that I think has been discussed to a greater extent in the sense of protecting scientifically and operationally fragile areas like a PSR, minimizing kind of the externalities of exploration. So these are kind of the things that motivated these ideas behind additional use of these witness plates. But the other thing that really motivated our team to look at this idea of these passive witness plates, these biscuits, are these concepts that I think are probably familiar to most of the people here. That the moon is not just a planet, it's an object floating around in space that has some homogeneous set of properties. It's very variable spatially, and it's variable over time. And here are just two quick examples that are probably familiar to you. One are temperature maps reconstructed from the binary in the top two panels of the left. And then the other is actually measurements of charged particle counts from the Charged Particle Lunar Environment experiment on ALSEP during a CME event. So that's exciting because you get to see kind of these charged particles that rise as you have at that time, what was that solar flare event that they described. But what you see here is that if you're trying to take a measurement on the moon, it will be incredibly sensitive to where exactly you're taking it, something that I think everybody is familiar with, over what time you're taking it and over the duration of time that you're taking it. And that's why we kind of came up with this idea of these biscuits. So just to give you, kind of orient you a little bit, this little like cartoon on the left just shows this initial idea we'd sketched up, which was that you can have basically this small passive plate that contains 4 different optimized targeted substrates. So that can mean anything from aerogel to fused silica to depending on the nature of the experiment you're looking at. And the reason why we kind of put this together was I was in a group kind of trying to threshold what were good sites for particular questions in terms of obtaining samples. And all the sample folks were like, well, you got to consider this, there are these other degeneracies. And I was like, well, has anybody ever put samples up and is this something where that would be helpful? And this idea of being able to have a controlled sample that can then be analyzed later is really what kind of was the impetus for this particular idea. So the idea behind these biscuits is that you have basically a set of substrates that can be shuttered initially, that might not be, but that also might have a covered section that can also act as a control, and that can be really heavily characterized before they're sent up. And there's some pretty obvious advantages to this. They can survive lunar night, they can track processes over however long they end up being up there. So that'll be a tricky part, getting them back. If you expect to have persistent exploration, you should be able to return them. But the nice thing is they do have a low environmental footprint. They're not using active electronics. They are pretty small and they're extensible. You can change out substrates. So if you want to measure how well a particular material does right next to the inside of a wall around a crater, in order to figure out whether you want to build a structure, you can do something like that and actually put it in there. So we think they can offer a really great means of examining really key processes in a sustainable way. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some things that we did that kind of looked at that. And there are two cases that we really examined. One is hydration, because we all care about water on the moon. And in this case, what we did is we used basically an infall model that was developed by Bill Farrell and a couple other folks in terms of total infall that might be generated due to sputtering and impact vaporization and other processes that operate inside PSR. So basically, in an area adjacent to a PSR, which is where you can imagine there might be a number of traverses that are focused on ISRUs, that are focused on really interesting scientific questions, you would expect to have basically ejection of water. The amount, I think, is probably not well known, but that's why we're using this particular model. And using that model, what we did is we selected a traverse in Amundsen and looked at basically residence time for H2O once it is actually transported and what the transport rates were. I can give you more details on this in the future. This is, again, 8 minutes makes it kind of difficult. But just to give you a sense of how much water you actually have transported along that traverse over time, you kind of get this cartoon where we kind of said over 3 lunar days, this is how much you would be able to retain at these particular positions along a temperature profile. And it was that temperature profile you kind of saw in that graph there. So it's unsurprisingly very sensitive, around 110 degrees Kelvin. And what you find here, really the basic thing about this is that you end up having abundances that are potentially extractable or really are things that you can examine using techniques like diffuse reflectance spectroscopy. And even if you can't, in some cases, you can put bounds on things in terms of transport. So I think that's another valuable thing. There's a process where you might not be able to extricate highest in our measurements. You can still put really critical spatially, basically relevant bounds on whatever processes, whatever measurements you want to look at. The other thing we also looked at is we had ST-TRIM-SP sputtering simulations. So if you, for example, had a perfect albite crystal in one of your substrate sections, you could then look at, based upon different fluence measurements, how much you would expect to have the top surface change in terms of composition. Liam Morsey, one of the co-authors, will be giving a talk on this at League with more detail. But basically, you can see a pretty significant change in surface composition over a pretty short period of time. So I think that's a pretty exciting thing. And this is not a large area. This is a 20 centimeter squared portion that's exposed. Now, that kind of brings me to the last portion of my talk, which is that while we're interested in this and we have substrates in mind, you know, we have all these other things we're excited about, processes we want to look at, really, this is something that I think anybody who is interested in capturing data on the moon in a sustainable way should be thinking about, because it, in theory, should not be extremely massive. It can be cost effective and is the type of thing, while you might not be able to get instantaneous gratification in terms of analysis, you can really measure longer, interesting timescales that are usually not accessible. So I'll leave it there, and I know there's probably other questions, but feel free to ask them offline too.
Thanks, Prabal, and perfectly on time. Is there any question that either you can raise your hand and ask the question directly, we can make this very interactive, or you can put the question in the chat as you prefer. And maybe while everybody is jumping on their keyboard, Prabal, how do you do the analysis in situ? So that is the more, I think, so you can either do, obviously, return these samples and treat them like normal samples, and that's probably easier. But I think an in situ analysis will need to be a longer term type of kind of process, because I think in order to have the instrumentation that can analyze some of these things in terms of like a mass spec or something like that, that you'd probably need to have specifically designed, or you would need to understand what thresholds you need to obtain to really get to target some of these processes. But I think a lot of this is substrate dependent. So we literally have people on our team who are like, well, actually, you might be able to just do like a remote X-ray fluorescence if you want to just get the top portion of something, you know, if you have somebody up there who has a handheld instrument. So there's actually a lot of
I think, flexibility in terms of how you can potentially do in situ stuff.
Okay.